The moment Georgia Maddox pressed her fingertips into the groove of those carved letters, she felt something shift in her chest that she had no name for yet, something warm and unnamed, and terrifying in the way that only real things ever are. It was the autumn of 1874, and the Montana Territory was the kind of place that swallowed people whole. The mountains rose up so steep and so sudden that on certain mornings, when the mist rolled down from the peaks and pooled in the valleys below, a person could convince themselves they were standing at the edge of the known world. For Georgia Maddox, that was not far from the truth. She had come west from Missouri the previous spring, riding in the back of a supply wagon with her younger brother Thomas, who was 20 years old and full of ambitions he had not yet learned to be careful about. Their father had died the winter before, taken by a fever that swept through their county like a slow and indifferent fire, and there was nothing left for them in Missouri but a mortgaged property and the particular grief of standing in rooms that still smelled like someone who was gone. Thomas had heard stories about the land grants available in Montana Territory, about the cattle money that men were making, about the sheer, wide-open possibility of a place that was still becoming itself. Georgia had listened to him talk for 3 months before she admitted that she could not let him go alone. She was 24 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept braided and pinned, green eyes that missed very little, and hands that had been calloused since she was 12 from working the Missouri farm. She was not the kind of woman who frightened easily, but she was also not the kind of woman who pretended that hard things were easy, and the Montana Territory was genuinely, legitimately hard. They had settled in a small valley community called Harrow Creek, which was not quite a town yet but was working earnestly toward becoming one. There was a general store run by a man named Vernon Pratt, a blacksmith operation, a livery, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and perhaps 40 residents scattered across the valley and up into the surrounding hills. The nearest proper town was Clearwater, 20 miles east, where there was a post office and a doctor and a marshal who mostly kept to his office. Georgia and Thomas had acquired a parcel of land on the eastern edge of the valley, 160 acres under the Homestead Act, with a creek running along the southern boundary, and a stand of pine and aspen that made the property feel more sheltered than exposed. They had built a modest one-room cabin that first summer, working harder than Georgia had ever worked in her life, which was saying something. Thomas had bought 4 head of cattle with the last of their combined savings and was determined to build a herd. It was a good life, or the beginning of one, but Harrow Creek had its complications. The most significant complication, at least as it concerned the day-to-day mechanics of survival, was the proximity of the mountains. The Bitterroot Range to the west was not merely scenery. It was a source of timber and game, and in bad weather, genuine mortal danger. Supply routes could be cut off for weeks at a time in winter. A person who got injured in the high country during a snowstorm was a person who needed to be very lucky or very resourceful. And the mountains had their own resident, a fact that the people of Harrow Creek mentioned in the offhand, accepting way that communities mention things that have simply always been true. His name was Lionel Bailey. The first time Georgia heard the name, she was standing in Vernon Pratt's general store, 3 weeks after arriving in Harrow Creek, waiting for a sack of cornmeal to be weighed out. The woman behind her, a farmer's wife named Clara Hench, who had a broad, kind face and an excellent instinct for useful information, leaned forward and said, almost conversationally, that Georgia ought to know about the mountain man up on the ridge if she was planning to settle in the valley. He is not sociable, Clara said, but he is not dangerous either, which is more than you can say for some men. He comes down maybe 3-4 times a year for supplies, keeps to himself. But he knows those mountains better than any man alive, and if you ever find yourself in trouble up there, he is the one to find. Has he lived up there long? Georgia asked. Going on 6 years now, Vernon Pratt said from behind the counter, not looking up from his scales. Came through after the war. He was Union, served in the Army of the Potomac if I have the story right. He does not talk about it and nobody presses him. He trades furs mostly, keeps a good garden in the summer, hunts. He built himself a proper cabin up there, not a shack. Man knows what he is doing. Georgia filed this information away with the same practical efficiency she applied to all new information about her circumstances. A mountain man, former soldier, solitary, knowledgeable, fine. She did not expect to think much more about it. But Harrow Creek was the kind of place where you notice things simply because there were not yet enough people and buildings to prevent it. The first time she actually saw Lionel Bailey, it was late October, and she was at the general store again to collect a parcel of thread and winterizing supplies. She almost missed him entirely because he came in while she was examining a bolt of wool fabric near the back wall, and she only registered the change in the room because the conversation between two men near the door stopped mid-sentence. He was taller than she expected. That was the first thing she thought, which was a strange first thought, because she had not really expected anything specific. He stood perhaps 6'2", broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who spent his days doing physical work, with dark hair that was longer than what was fashionable, and a beard that was neatly kept despite what you might assume about a man who lived alone on a mountain. He was wearing a canvas coat over a wool shirt, and he carried himself with a stillness that Georgia associated with people who spent a lot of time alone, that particular economy of movement that comes from not needing to perform for anyone. He was, she noted with a kind of neutral observational clarity, probably around 30 years old. The lines around his eyes were from squinting in sun and wind rather than from age. He did not look at anyone in particular when he came in. He went directly to the counter, set down a bundle wrapped in burlap, and spoke quietly to Vernon Pratt about a trade of furs for a list of supplies he produced from his coat pocket. Vernon nodded and began pulling things from shelves. Georgia went back to examining the wool fabric. She was aware, in the careful peripheral way she had developed for navigating new places, that he was aware of her, not in any intrusive or uncomfortable way. Simply the awareness that there was a person in the room he had not seen before. She did not make anything of it. He took his supplies and left without speaking to anyone else. The conversation near the door resumed. That might have been the entirety of their connection for months, perhaps longer, had the winter not arrived the way it did that year, fast and ferocious, and with very little of the warning that experienced settlers had learned to read. The first heavy snow came in mid-November, 2 weeks earlier than anyone had expected. Thomas had gone to Clearwater to register some paperwork for their land claim and had not made it back before the snow closed the road. Georgia received a note via a neighbor who had turned back from the route, scratched in Thomas's handwriting on a scrap of paper, telling her he was staying with the Clearwater hotel keeper until the road cleared and that she should not worry. She did not precisely worry, but she took stock of her situation with honest eyes. The cattle were in the small barn she and Thomas had finished in September, and they had enough hay stored to last them provided the snow did not stay beyond 3 weeks. She had enough food. The cabin was sound and well chinked, and she had a good supply of firewood stacked against the eastern wall. She was competent, and she was not afraid of being alone. What she had not accounted for was the way the temperature dropped on the third night. Not gradually the way cold usually came, but all at once, savagely, the kind of cold that found every small gap in the thinking of even careful people. She woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of wind that had taken on a new register entirely, and she built the fire up and sat close to it and listened to the cabin working against the storm. In the morning, she discovered that one of her 4 cattle had gotten loose from the barn. The fence post at the north corner of the small paddock had given way under the weight of accumulated snow, and the cattle, who had more intelligence than she sometimes credited them with, had found it. 3 had wandered only a short distance and were not difficult to locate and return. The 4th was gone. Georgia put on every layer of clothing she owned, wrapped herself in the heaviest blanket she had, and followed the tracks north and west up the hillside because that was where they led. She was not going to lose a quarter of their herd to a single cold morning. That was not acceptable. The tracks led up. The wind had softened the snow enough in places to obscure them, and she was forced to slow down and read the landscape carefully, which required her to go further than she had intended, higher than was strictly wise, into the lower reaches of the pine forests that climbed toward the ridge. She found the cattle 3/4 of a mile up the slope, standing in a shallow declivity between two large boulders where the wind had not reached, and the snow was merely knee-deep instead of chest-deep. She was enormously relieved and also aware, as she stood there with her hands stinging from cold and her breath coming in white clouds, that she was further from the cabin than was comfortable in these conditions. She had the rope she had brought for leading the animal back. The trouble was that her hands had lost enough feeling that the simple mechanics of looping the rope around the animal's neck required more concentration than it should have. She was working at it when she heard something behind her. She turned. Lionel Bailey was standing at the edge of the tree line, 20 yards away, with a rifle slung over his shoulder and an expression of composed assessment on his face. He looked at her, he looked at the cattle, he looked at the tracks she had made coming up the hill. "Let me," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected. Quiet, not aggressive. She almost said she was fine. But her hands genuinely were not working correctly, and the cattle was beginning to show signs of wanting to move in a direction she did not want, and pragmatism had always been something Georgia valued over pride. She held out the rope. He crossed the snow without particular difficulty, took the rope from her hands with an efficiency that made her feel both grateful and briefly humbled, and had the rope around the animal's neck in 3 practiced seconds. He checked the knot, then looked at her hands. "How long have you been out?" he asked. "An hour, maybe slightly more," she said. He looked at her hands again with an expression that communicated something specific and not entirely comfortable to receive. He reached into his coat and produced a pair of heavy wool gloves that were clearly his own. "Put these on," he said. "You will need them yourself," she said. "My hands are used to it," he said, and his tone was not unkind, but it was final, and she could see from his hands, which were large and bare and clearly not suffering the way hers were, that he was telling the truth. She put on the gloves. He led the cattle down the slope with the practiced ease of a man who moved in this landscape the way other people moved in drawing rooms, naturally and without conscious navigation. Georgia walked beside him and said nothing because he seemed to be the kind of person who did not require conversation to fill silence, and she found, to her mild surprise, that she was the same way. They made it back to her paddock without incident. He repaired the fence post, driving the new support stake she brought him from the barn with a large rock he found nearby, working without being asked and without discussion, just doing what needed to be done. When it was done, he stood back and checked the stability of the repair with a professional eye. "That will hold," he said. "Thank you," Georgia said. She meant it plainly, without ornament. "I am Georgia Maddox, my brother Thomas, and I have the property here." He looked at her for a moment, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, in a way that seemed to be considering something. "Lionel Bailey," he said. "I am up on the ridge." "I know," she said. "I have heard of you." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not quite discomfort, more like a person adjusting to new information about how they exist in the world of other people. "Is there anything else needs doing before this storm gets worse?" he asked. She looked at the sky. He was right that it was going to get worse. She could see that now that she was paying attention to it the way he seemed to pay attention to everything, with a constant low-level reading of conditions. "I have enough of everything," she said. "I will be fine." He nodded once, retrieved the rope she had returned to him, and walked back up the slope toward the tree line. She watched him go and then went inside and stood by the fire for a long time, letting feeling return to her hands, thinking about nothing in particular, which was not entirely true. The winter passed. Thomas came back when the road cleared, full of energy and news about land values and cattle prices, and a man in Clearwater he had met who was interested in a potential cattle driving partnership. Georgia listened and cooked and helped with the cattle, and did the 100 ordinary tasks of a homestead in winter, splitting firewood and checking the weatherproofing, and mending what needed mending. She thought about Lionel Bailey occasionally, the way she thought about the mountains, as a feature of the landscape that was there whether she was thinking about it or not. She did not see him again until March, when the snow was softening and the creek along the southern boundary of their property was running again with a particular exuberance that she found genuinely cheerful. She had gone down to the creek in the late afternoon to check on whether the small footbridge she and Thomas had built over the narrowest crossing was still sound after the winter, and she found, to her interest, that someone had replaced 2 of the boards on the bridge in her absence. The new boards were a different shade from the old ones, clearly freshly cut, fitted with a precision that was noticeably better than the work she and Thomas had done in their first summer exhaustion. She stood looking at this for a while. There were no other tracks around the bridge except some that had been largely erased by a recent melt. She could not be certain, but the workmanship had a quality that she associated with the spare efficiency of a man who had repaired a fence post in a blizzard without needing to be asked. She said nothing about it to Thomas. She was not sure why. It felt like something private, though she could not have explained what that meant precisely. The spring came in fully by April, and Harrow Creek began to wake up with it. New settlers arrived, a family named Dobriscu from Ohio, who were extremely pleasant and absolutely bewildered by their first sight of the Bitterroot Range. A second general store opened at the south end of the settlement, which caused some tension with Vernon Pratt that the community navigated with the careful diplomacy of small places that could not afford lasting conflict. Georgia started a kitchen garden in the cleared area behind the cabin, and planted it with the deliberate attention of someone who understood that the line between thriving and merely surviving often came down to whether or not you had put enough vegetables in the ground in April. Thomas got his cattle partnership arrangement worked out with the Clearwater man, whose name was Edmund Farley, and this meant he was gone several days a month riding fence lines and discussing numbers that Georgia found moderately interesting, and Thomas found endlessly absorbing. She did not mind being alone. She had always been comfortable in her own company, but she was also honest with herself, and she was honest with herself about the fact that she sometimes found herself looking toward the ridge. The second time she encountered Lionel Bailey directly was in May, at Vernon Pratt's store, and it was unremarkable in all the ways that matter and remarkable in all the ways that last. He came in while she was there, as he had done in October, and nodded at Vernon and began his trade. She was there for mail, which had just come up from Clearwater, and she was reading a letter from her mother's sister in Missouri while she waited for Vernon to finish with another customer. She was aware of Lionel Bailey the way she was always aware of him when he was in a room, with that peripheral attentiveness that she had decided, with the self-honesty she prized, was simply curiosity about a person who was difficult to read. He finished his business and was heading for the door when he paused. She did not look up from her letter. She heard him stop. "The creek bridge held through the winter well," she said, still reading. There was a pause. "The boards were getting soft," he said. "Another season and they would have given." "I appreciated it," she said, and now she looked up and he was looking at her with that composed, careful expression that she was beginning to understand was not coldness but a kind of precision. He was a man who did not say things carelessly. "You were managing fine," he said. It was not quite a compliment and not quite simply a statement of fact. It was somewhere in between, and she thought it might have been the most specific and accurate thing anyone had said to her since she arrived in Montana territory. "Most days," she said. He looked at her for another moment and then went out. She went back to her letter, but she was smiling slightly, in a way she did not examine until later that evening when she was sitting by the fire after supper, and then she examined it and found it complicated and set it aside with the practical decisiveness she brought to most things. Through May and June, they saw each other perhaps 5 or 6 times, always briefly, always in the context of errands or the accidental overlapping of paths. He came down the ridge more often in the warmer months, she understood, because the trail was passable and he had more trading to do. She noticed that he had a particular way of scanning a room when he entered it, quick and without apparent anxiety. The way a man did when he had learned to be aware of his surroundings not out of paranoia, but out of the long practical habit of someone who had been in places where awareness was the difference between outcomes. She thought about Clara's mention of the war, the Army of the Potomac, and what that meant for a man who had ended up alone on a mountain in Montana Territory in 1874. She did not ask. It was not her business, but she thought about it. In July, there was a barn raising for the Dobrescu family, who had finally gotten enough lumber together for the structure they needed, and the whole community came out for it, because that was what communities did. The work was social and genuine, and loud with the particular cheerfulness of people who are building something together, and Georgia found herself in the agreeable position of someone who is good with her hands and knows it, working on the upper section of the south wall alongside several other women who had come with food and stayed to help with construction, because that was also what they did. Lionel Bailey was there. She had not expected this, though she was not sure why. He came with no particular fanfare, spoke to no one except when spoken to, and went directly to where he was most needed, which turned out to be the raising of the main beam, a job that required both height and strength and several men working in precise coordination. He worked with calm efficiency alongside men who were clearly glad to have him there, and she watched him from her position on the south wall and thought that he was someone who understood, at a deep structural level, how things fit together. Not just wood and beams. Things. When the main frame was up and the community paused for the noon meal, Clara Hinch materialized at George's elbow with the reliability of a person who had excellent social timing. "You have been watching him," Clara said pleasantly, as if she were commenting on the weather. "I have been watching the construction," Georgia said. "Of course you have," Clara said, in a tone that communicated everything without saying anything further, and handed her a plate of roasted corn and salt pork, and the subject was closed. But Georgia found, as the afternoon went on and the walls of the Dobrescu barn went up with the satisfying physicality of real work accomplished, that she was keeping track of where Lionel Bailey was in the way you keep track of something that you have already, without making a formal decision about it, begun to care about. He did not seek her out during the day. But at one point in the late afternoon, when she was trying to drive a particularly stubborn nail into a green board that kept splitting, he appeared beside her with the quiet materialization she was beginning to associate with him, took the nail and the hammer from her with a brief explanatory gesture, set the nail at a slightly different angle and drove it clean with 3 strokes. He handed the hammer back. "The angle," he said. "The grain runs that way." "I see that now," she said. They were standing close enough that she could see the line of concentration along his jaw, and the way his eyes moved when he looked at something he was trying to understand. She turned back to the wall and he went back to wherever he had come from, and she stood very still for a moment before she picked up the next nail. It was late July, a few weeks after the barn raising, that she found it. She had gone down to the creek crossing to check the garden irrigation channel she and Thomas had dug along the south fence line, because it had been running unevenly after a stretch of dry days. The work took her further along the creek bank than usual, and she ended up at the base of a large, old pine that stood at the corner of the property, where the creek boundary turned north. The tree was massive and old and had been there long before any of the settlers in the valley, and its base was thick with roots that emerged from the ground in sculptural, dramatic curves. Between 2 of the larger roots, where a flat section of the root system had grown out and up into something approaching a surface, she noticed markings. She crouched down. Someone had carved into the root in letters that were neat and deliberate and clearly done with a sharp blade by a hand that had taken some care about it. A single word. Georgia. She stared at it. The carving was not new. The edges of the letters had begun to smooth as the wood grew around them, just slightly, which meant it had been there for some weeks at least. The work was precise. The letters were well formed, not in the hasty scratch of someone leaving an idle mark, but in the careful, unhurried stroke of someone who had thought about what they were doing. She pressed her fingertips into the groove of the letters and felt something shift in her chest that she had no name for yet. She sat back on her heels and looked at the carving for a long time. She did not tell Thomas. She did not mention it to Clara Hench or to anyone in Harrow Creek. She went home and made supper and sat by the fire after Thomas had fallen asleep and thought about a man on a mountain who had known her name and said nothing about it, who had come down from his ridge and fixed her bridge and helped her understand the grain of a board and carved her name into a root at the edge of her property, and had never once spoken it aloud. There was something about that which reached into her chest and held on. She did not know what to do with it. She was not, by nature, a woman who was passive about things she wanted, but she was also a woman who had learned the difference between moving toward something too quickly and simply letting herself understand what she was feeling before she acted on it. So she sat with it for several days, the way you sit with something that is both wonderful and vertiginous, and she tried to understand what she actually felt. What she felt, she eventually concluded, with the honesty she always brought to her own interior examination, was that she had been thinking about Lionel Bailey with a regularity and a warmth that had very little to do with the practical usefulness of having a capable man on the ridge above her property. She thought about the way he moved. She thought about the economy of his words and the precision of them, how when he said something it was always the thing he meant and not the nearest available approximation. She thought about the gloves in the blizzard, removed from his own hands and given to hers without ceremony or the expectation of gratitude. She thought about the bridge boards in March. She thought about the nail angle. She thought about all the small, quiet ways that this man had been present at the edge of her life for 8 months, never intruding, never demanding, but consistently, reliably there when it mattered. And she thought about the carving and the fact that he had written her name somewhere private and said nothing, and what that told her about the kind of man he was. The kind who felt things deeply and held them carefully, who did not press or perform but who expressed himself in the private language of actions. The kind of person for whom saying something mattered enormously, and who therefore did not say it until he was sure. She decided she would say nothing about the carving for a while. She was not ready yet to speak it, and she thought that he was not ready either, and that for now it was enough to know it was there. It felt like an understanding between them that neither of them had put into words, and sometimes those understandings were more true than the ones you had to negotiate aloud. August was hot and full and productive. The garden yielded abundantly. Thomas's cattle partnership with Edmund Farley was going well, and he came home from his Clearwater trips bright-eyed and full of numbers that made Georgia feel genuinely hopeful about the shape of their life here. She had taken on some sewing work for the community, mending, and some simple garment construction, which brought in modest additional income and gave her a reason to be present in the social life of Harrow Creek in a way that felt useful rather than merely social. She saw Lionel Bailey twice in August. Once at the store briefly, where they exchanged a nod and 2 sentences about whether the creek was running well. Once on the trail north of her property, where she was walking to check on a fence line, and he was coming down from the ridge with a pack frame loaded with furs. He stopped when he saw her, and they walked the same direction for a quarter-mile before their paths diverged, and in that quarter-mile they talked more continuously than they had at any previous point. She told him about the irrigation channel she had been working on, about the problem with the green boards in the channel walls. He told her, without preamble, about a better method using flat stones laid in a specific pattern that he had seen used further north, and they talked through the mechanics of it with the straightforward engagement of two people who both understood practical things and were comfortable in that shared understanding. When their paths diverged, he tipped his hat, which was a gesture so ordinary that it should have been unremarkable, but Georgia found she thought about it on and off for the rest of the afternoon. She went back to the pine tree at the creek corner a few days later, not for any specific reason she admitted to herself, but she went. She crouched down by the root and looked at the carving, and she traced the letters with one finger, and she sat there in the warm August afternoon light with the creek running nearby and the pines shifting in a small high wind, and she felt something that she recognized, with a quiet and certain clarity, as love beginning. Not the dramatic arrival of it, the steady accumulation of it. The kind that comes from watching someone be themselves, consistently and without pretense, over many months, and finding that what you see makes something in you grow toward them the way a plant grows toward light, unarguably, without needing to decide. She stood up, brushed the pine needles from her skirt, and went home. In September there was trouble, not the dramatic and violent kind that stories about the West sometimes emphasized, though that kind existed and was real, and no one in Harrow Creek was entirely unaware of it. This was the slower, meaner kind of trouble that came from property and money, and the particular aggression of men who had decided that the law was an inconvenience rather than a structure. A ranching operation based out of the Clearwater area, owned by a man named Harlan Voss, had been expanding its footprint through the valley with a combination of legal and less than legal means for the past 2 years. Voss was not a violent man in the obvious sense, but he had a foreman named Cutter who was, and he had the financial resources to file competing land claims, flood small homesteaders with paperwork, and otherwise make the business of staying on your land more complicated and expensive than many people could sustain. 3 families in the valley had already sold their claims to Voss at prices that were technically voluntary, but had been arrived at through a sustained campaign of fence cutting, diverted water rights, and legal harassment. The Maddox property was, as it turned out, of particular interest to the Voss operation because of the creek access and the quality of the grazing land. Georgia discovered this when she came home from a sowing visit at the Dobriscu property one afternoon in early September to find that the north fence line had been cut and that 2 of her cattle had gotten through and were grazing on the adjacent land, which was already claimed by Voss. She fixed the fence herself, retrieved her cattle, and sat down that evening and thought carefully about what was happening and what she could do about it. Thomas was in Clearwater on partnership business and would not be back for 2 days. She wrote down everything she observed and the dates of it, because she understood instinctively that documentation was a form of power that was available to her even when other forms were not. The next morning, Cutter himself appeared at her gate. He was a lean, sun-darkened man in his late 30s with pale eyes and the practiced ease of someone who used physical intimidation so habitually that it had become unconscious. He tipped his hat and smiled and told her that the Voss operation would be willing to offer her a fair price for the property, given that homesteading alone was difficult for a woman. Georgia stood in her doorway with her hands in her apron pockets and looked at him with a steadiness she had cultivated over years of dealing with men who assumed that steadiness was a thing she would not have, and she told him politely but with complete clarity that she had no interest in selling, that she had documentation of the fence cutting which she would be forwarding to the marshal in Clearwater, and that she expected the matter would be resolved legally. Cutter smiled again with less warmth and tipped his hat again and left. Georgia went inside and sat down and took 3 slow, deliberate breaths, and then she got up and wrote the letter to the Clearwater marshal. She did not know that Lionel Bailey had watched this exchange from the tree line above the property, because he came down from the ridge sometimes in the mornings, and he had arrived at the edge of the pines just as Cutter rode up. He stayed until Cutter left, and then he stayed a little while longer, and then he went back up the mountain, but he was not easy in his mind about it. He had been watching the Voss operations movements for months, the way you watch weather systems when you live in a landscape where weather can kill you. He knew what it looked like when men like Cutter were working a property. He had seen it before, in the valley and elsewhere, and it rarely resolved cleanly without someone pressing back with more than letters. He came down to Harrow Creek the next day. He found Georgia at her garden, harvesting the last of the late summer vegetables with the focused efficiency he associated with everything she did. "I was up on the ridge yesterday morning," he said, without preamble, because they had gotten to the point in their acquaintance where preamble would have felt false. She looked up from the row of carrots she was clearing. She did not seem surprised that he knew. "You saw him," she said. "I did," he said. "Cutter. He is not a careful man, but he is a persistent one." "I have written to the marshal," she said. "That is the right thing to do," he said. "But it takes time. In the meantime," he stopped. "In the meantime," she said, and waited for him to finish. "I come down this way most mornings," he said. "I always have with the trapping line. I could come by the east fence line." She understood what he was offering. Not protection in the aggressive sense that would create its own problems, but presence, witness, the particular deterrence that came from a man like Lionel Bailey being visibly known to be in the area. Cutter and men like him made their calculations, and a mountain man who knew the terrain intimately and who was clearly friendly with the homesteader they were trying to harass was a variable that complicated those calculations. "I would appreciate that," she said. He nodded. "The carrots look good," he said after a brief pause. "Best yield I have gotten yet," she said, and she was smiling. He looked at her smiling and then looked at the carrots, and she thought she saw something in his expression that was not quite its usual carefully composed self, something that was softer at the edges in a way that made her want to look at it more closely. But then it was gone, and he was his usual self again, and they talked practically about the fence line and he left. That night she sat by the fire and thought about all of it, the Voss situation and the marshal's letter and the morning fence line visits and the carving at the creek, and she thought, "I am going to have to say something eventually." And she thought, not yet, but soon. Thomas came back from Clearwater with useful news about the marshal. The letter had apparently arrived at a good time, because there was already an inquiry in progress regarding Voss's land acquisition methods, driven by two other Harrow Creek families who had retained a lawyer in Clearwater named Morrison who was building a case. Thomas had spoken to Morrison himself and come away with cautious optimism and a list of documentation they needed to compile. The practical work of it was something Georgia was good at. She had always had a clear, organized mind, and over the next several weeks she put together a thorough record of the fence cuttings, the dates, the condition of the land, the conversations with Cutter, all of it set down in her clear, even handwriting in a ledger that Morrison eventually praised as the most well-organized documentation he had received in any homesteader dispute he had handled. This gave her a quiet, strong satisfaction. Lionel Bailey came by the east fence line most mornings in September and October. Sometimes she saw him. Sometimes she only knew he had been there from the boot prints in the soft earth by the corner post. He never made a show of it. He never suggested that she needed him. He was simply there, reliably and without requiring anything from her for it. And she found that this quality in him, this uncomplicated and undemanding presence, was something she valued more than she could easily articulate. There were mornings when she made a point of being at the east fence line when he came, and they would talk for 20 minutes or half an hour, leaning on the fence posts in the morning light, and she learned things about him in the way you learn things about careful people, slowly and in pieces that each have weight. She learned that he had grown up in Pennsylvania, in a small industrial town near Pittsburgh, the son of a machinist, that he had 3 younger sisters, all of whom he wrote to twice a year, and that he worried about them in a steady background way that he did not discuss but that surfaced occasionally in the way He talked about what women in small towns were expected to endure. She learned that he had joined the Union Army at 19 and served for the duration of the war, and that he did not talk about specific events from that time, but that the war had left its marks on him in the way it left marks on everyone who survived it, not all of them visible. She learned that he had come west not running from anything specific, but toward something undefined, the way people do when they need more space than the world they were born in can give them. That he had found the Montana mountains and felt, for the first time since childhood, that the size of his surroundings matched the size of the quiet that he needed. That he had built his cabin over 2 full seasons, taking his time with it, and that it was the best thing he had ever made with his hands. She told him things too. About her father, about Missouri, about the specific grief of losing the only parent you had left and having to decide, in the middle of that grief, what your life was going to be now. About the particular feeling of arriving somewhere entirely new and having to build everything from scratch, which was frightening and also, she admitted, with the honesty she always had about herself, genuinely exciting. About what she wanted, which was simply to be on land that was hers, doing work that was real, in a place that was wide enough for the kind of life she meant to have. He listened to all of this with the attention he gave to things that mattered to him, which was complete and undivided, and made her feel that what she was saying had been genuinely heard. One morning in mid-October, they were at the fence line in a light drizzle that neither of them was paying much attention to, and she told him about the bridge boards in March, about how she had known it was him. He was quiet for a moment. "The boards were dangerous," he said. "I could see it from the ridge with a glass." "You carry a glass on the ridge?" she asked. "I keep track of the valley," he said, and then after a pause that she thought was actually slightly uncomfortable for him, "I keep track of what is mine to notice." She looked at him. He was looking at the fence post. "That is a very careful way of saying something," she said. He looked at her then, and the composed expression was genuinely open for a moment, open in a way that she felt in her chest, and he said, "I am working on being less careful." She held his gaze and said, "Take your time." Something that was very close to a smile crossed his face, and then the drizzle picked up, and they both agreed it was time to go about the day's work. And they parted, and Georgia walked back to her cabin in the October rain with something bright and warm and entirely settled happening inside her. November brought the resolution of the Voss situation. Morrison's case, combined with the documentation from Georgia and 3 other families, produced enough of a legal record that the Clearwater Marshal took it to the Territorial Authority. And Voss, who was ultimately a businessman and not a principled defender of questionable methods, agreed to a settlement that included the withdrawal of his competing claims on the Maddox property and the other contested homesteads, the payment of a nominal fine, and the termination of Cutter's employment, which was the condition the smaller properties cared most about. It was not perfect justice. Voss kept most of what he had already acquired, and 2 of the families who had sold before the legal action were not made whole. Georgia did not look away from the inadequacy of that. She spoke to one of those families, the Hendersons, directly, and helped them navigate the available options, which were limited but not nothing. And she felt, in doing this, both the genuine limitation of what she could accomplish and the genuine value of doing what was within her power. But the Maddox property was secure. Thomas came home from the final Clearwater meeting vibrating with relief and pride, and Georgia made the best supper she could manage, and they sat at their table and ate together with the specific satisfaction of people who had faced something difficult and come through it with their home intact. "Morrison said your documentation was what made the case," Thomas said, gesturing with his fork. "He said without your ledger, they might not have had enough." "It was all our work together," Georgia said. "It was mostly you," Thomas said, which was true, and she accepted it without argument because it was true. That night she went asleep thinking about what came next. The winter preparations, the garden that would need covering, the second year of the homestead stretching ahead of her with the particular promise of something you have survived and can now properly inhabit. She was also thinking about Lionel Bailey, and the fact that she had not said anything yet about the carving, and that it was October still when she found it, and now it was November, and the specific silence she had been keeping felt like it had served its purpose and was ready to be ended. She went to the creek corner the next morning, not the fence line, the creek corner. She crouched down by the old pine root and looked at the carving, and it was still there, the letters slightly more smoothed by time but still clear, still her name, still his knife work. She stayed there a while, thinking about what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it, and then she did what she had never done when she found the carving on that first morning in July. She took her own pocket knife, the small one she carried for garden work, and below his carving, with as much care as she could manage, she carved a single letter. L, just that. One letter fitting neatly below her name. She sat back and looked at it, his carving and hers together, and she felt the thing in her chest that she had been calling unnamed since July arrange itself into something with a form she recognized. Then she went to the east fence line. He was already there. He had been coming every morning so long that it had become simply a part of how the days were organized for both of them. She leaned on the fence post next to him and looked out at the morning, which was cold and clear and extraordinarily beautiful in the way that November mornings in Montana were, the light hitting the frost on the grass so that the whole field threw back small cold sparks. "I should tell you something," she said. He waited. "I found the carving," she said. "In July. I found it the same week you made it, I think, from how the wood looked." He was very still beside her. "I did not say anything," she said, "not because it frightened me, because it mattered too much to say carelessly, and I needed to understand what I was going to say before I said it. And now," he said, his voice was very quiet, "now I went this morning and I carved something next to it," she said. "I think you should go look at it." He turned and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the morning light was on both of them, and there was nothing careful or composed about his expression now. There was just him, the real version of him that she had been catching glimpses of for months, the version that was warm and present and entirely, unmistakably there for her. "Georgia," he said, and it was the first time she had heard him say her name aloud, and it came out the way it must have looked when he carved it, like something he had been holding carefully for a long time. "Go look at it," she said softly. He went. She stayed at the fence and looked at the frost on the grass and waited. She heard the creek running at the south end of the property, and a hawk somewhere above the ridge, and the wind in the pines. When he came back, he came across the frost-silvered field toward her with a directness and a purpose that he usually kept carefully leashed, and when he got to the fence he stopped and looked at her from a foot away with everything in him visible, and she thought that whatever she had expected the ending of this long, slow, quiet beginning to feel like, she had not expected it to feel this inevitable. "L," he said. "That is what you are to me," she said. He reached out, very slowly, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a touch that was so careful and so full of everything he had not said aloud for months that she felt it in every nerve she had. "I have wanted to say your name out loud since August," he said. "I have been saying it up on the mountain where no one could hear it." "I know," she said. "I think I always knew." "What do you want?" he asked quietly, directly, in the way he asked everything that mattered. "I want to know you properly," she said. "I want you to come down off the mountain and have supper with me and Thomas. I want to talk to you about everything you know about these mountains. I want to sit by the fire with you on cold nights." She paused. "I want to see what this is when we let it be what it is." He looked at her for a long moment. "I can do all of those things," he said. "Starting with supper tonight," she said. He almost smiled. "Starting with supper tonight," he agreed. Thomas, to his immense credit, handled the situation with a grace that Georgia had not been entirely certain he possessed. He had been watching his sister for months with the particular attentiveness of a younger brother, who understood that he owed her an enormous debt of gratitude for everything she had carried since their father died. And he had noticed the way she looked toward the ridge, and he had noticed the morning fence line walks, and he was not entirely surprised when she came inside that afternoon and said, with a directness that was entirely characteristic, that Lionel Bailey was coming to supper. Thomas shook his hand at the door with warmth and showed him immediately to the table, and over a supper of salt-cured pork and boiled potatoes and the last of the autumn squash. The three of them talked for 3 hours about cattle ranching and mountain trapping, and the mechanics of creek irrigation, and the legal situation with Voss, and what the territory would look like in 10 years. And by the end of it, Thomas had decided, with a clarity that pleased Georgia, that Lionel Bailey was exactly the kind of man he would have hoped his sister would find. After supper, Thomas went to bed with the practiced early retirement of a tactful person, and Georgia and Lionel sat by the fire and talked some more. Not about anything specific, about everything. The kind of conversation that happens when two people have been saving things up for months and are finally in the position of being able to say them. He told her about the cabin on the ridge, about the view from the eastern window at dawn, when the light came over the mountains in a way that was different every morning and never ordinary, about the winter up there, which was genuinely hard but which he had come to love in the way you love things that demand your full attention, about the work of trapping and tanning and the particular satisfaction of a life in which everything was directly connected to what you actually did. She told him about Missouri, about the specific quality of the light there, which was different from Montana light in a way she could not quite describe except to say that Montana light was bigger. About what she had felt, arriving in the valley and seeing the mountains for the first time, that simultaneously humbling and expansive sensation of encountering something so much larger than yourself, that your own smallness becomes a relief rather than a diminishment. When it was late and the fire was down to coals, she walked him to the door and he stopped on the threshold and turned to her. "I will come by the fence line tomorrow," he said. "I will be there," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the dim light from the coals. "Georgia," he said again, and it still sounded like something he had been saving, something precious and specific. "Good night, Lionel," she said. He walked back up toward the ridge in the November dark, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go until he was absorbed into the pines, and she felt the particular compound emotion of someone standing at the beginning of something real. The winter of 1874 to 1875 was the winter that made them. He came to supper twice a week through December and January. Not every night, because he had his trapline to run and she had her winter work, and both of them were people who understood that a good life included solitude as one of its components. But twice a week, with a regularity that became as much a part of the rhythm of the cabin as the fire and the morning chores, he came down off the mountain and sat at the table with her and Thomas, and the three of them ate and talked, and the cabin felt full in a way that Georgia had not realized it had been missing. On the nights he did not come for supper, she sometimes went to the east fence line in the afternoons, and he came down from the ridge and they walked along the property together in the cold, talking or not talking, learning the specific vocabulary of each other's silences. She learned that his quiet was comfortable, that it was not absence but a kind of presence that had its own quality, and he learned that hers was the same, that she was a woman who did not need to fill space with words and found it restful to be with someone who understood that. He brought her things, sometimes. A piece of unusual quartz he found in the creek bed above the ridge. A small pine carving, nothing elaborate, just a shape he had cut while sitting at his fire, an approximate rendering of a hawk that she recognized from the ridge. A jar of honey from a hive he had found in a hollow tree, which was sweet and dark, and tasted of everything that grew on the mountain. She cooked things she thought he would like. She noticed what he ate with most pleasure and made more of it. She set aside the good wool she had found at the store in September, and made him a pair of mittens over the course of 3 evenings that fit his large hands properly, which the pair he had been wearing did not. When she gave him the mittens, standing at the east fence line on a gray February morning with the snow deep around the posts, he looked at them for a moment and then at her. "You measured the other pair," he said. I borrowed them from your coat pocket one morning in November when you were looking at the fence line. I returned them before you noticed." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh freely, without the slight restraint he usually had, and it was warm and real, and it made her want to hear it again. "I noticed," he said. "I did not know what to make of it." "Now you know," she said. He put the mittens on and flexed his hands in them with evident satisfaction, and then he reached out and took her mittened hand in his and held it, standing there at the fence in the February cold, for a long, warm moment. It was the first time he had held her hand. She thought about the care with which he did things, and she thought that he had been waiting until the moment felt right, which it did, completely and simply. "I was thinking," he said, looking at their joined hands, "about the spring." "What about it?" she said. "I was thinking I would like to show you the view from the cabin in the morning, the eastern window." She looked at him. "That would require me to be there before dawn," she said. "Yes," he said. "I would like that very much," she said. In March, when the snow began its slow retreat from the lower slopes, she climbed up to his cabin for the first time. He came down to meet her halfway, which she appreciated but did not need, and they climbed the rest of the way together. The cabin was everything he had described and more. It was built with the same precise care she associated with everything he made. The logs fitted tightly, the windows placed where they would catch both light and the specific views he had wanted, the interior organized with the spare functionality of a man who was comfortable with exactly what he needed and did not require more. It was clean and solid and completely, unmistakably his, and standing in it, she understood something about him that all the months of fence-line conversations and supper evenings had been building toward but had not quite delivered, which was the full picture of who he was when he was entirely himself. She sat in the chair by the eastern window and waited for the dawn, with him sitting on the floor beside her, because there was only one chair and he had given it to her without discussion. And when the light came over the mountains, it was exactly what he had said, different from anything she had ever seen. The peaks going from black to gray to gold to blazing white in a progression that lasted only minutes, but that she did not look away from for a second. "This is yours," she said softly, meaning the view and the light and the whole mountain life he had made. "Yes," he said. "You built all of this," she said. "I did," he said. She looked at him in the morning light. He was looking at her. "You should not have to give it up," she said. "I have not been thinking about giving it up," he said carefully. "I have been thinking about what it would look like if it were also yours." She held his gaze. "That is a very large thing to think about," she said. "I am a careful thinker," he said, and there was a warmth in it that was entirely his. "I know you are," she said. He proposed to her at the east fence line on a morning in April when the valley was coming back to green, and the creek was full and running fast, and the mountains above them were still white at the tops. He did it plainly and directly, and with the same honest precision he brought to everything that mattered to him. "I want to marry you," he said. "If you want that, I think about you every morning and every evening and most of the time in between, and I think that is something that does not go away, and I would rather be building something with you than being separately capable." Georgia looked at the mountains and then at him. "I have been wanting you to say that since February," she said. "That was when I was sure," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to marry you." He took her face in both hands with the same deliberate care he brought to everything, and kissed her. And it was like the moment when you have been working toward something for a long time, and it becomes real, that specific satisfaction that is both sweet and solid. They were married in June of 1875, in the small church in Harrow Creek that doubled as a schoolhouse, on a Saturday when the whole community came, because that was what the community did, and because Lionel Bailey coming down off his mountain ridge to marry Georgia Maddox was the kind of event that the people of Harrow Creek felt genuinely invested in. Clara Hinch cried, which surprised no one. Thomas stood up as the one to give his sister away, which he did with enormous dignity and only slightly wet eyes. Vernon Pratt closed the store for the afternoon. The Dobrescu family brought an extraordinary quantity of food that they had been planning for a month. Lionel wore his best coat, which Georgia had seen once before and which fit him very well, and she wore the dress she had made herself from the good blue wool she had found at the store in September, the fabric she had been saving without knowing exactly what she was saving it for, but with a sense that it was waiting for something worth it. It was. He held her hand through the whole ceremony, and when the minister asked him to speak his vows, he did it in his own words rather than the traditional form, because the minister, who was a practical and open-minded man named Reverend Alcott, had asked if he had something he wanted to say, and he did. "I will be present," Lionel said, "every morning at the fence line and every supper and every winter. I will be honest and careful with you and with what we build. I will not make you smaller than you are. And I will always tell you when I have carved your name somewhere, so you do not have to find it on your own." There was a sound from the assembled community that was somewhere between laughter and recognition. Georgia, who had not known he was going to say that, felt something flood through her that was entirely warm and entirely his. "I will grow things," she said when it was her turn. "Not just in the garden. I am good at making things grow, and I intend to keep doing that with you. I will not be easy always because I am not. But I will be true, and I will be here, and I will always come out to the fence line in the morning." Reverend Alcott pronounced them married, and Lionel kissed her with the whole of Harrow Creek watching, and it was good. They made a life that was genuinely and specifically theirs. They kept both properties, because it turned out that 2 parcels of land in a productive valley were more valuable than one, and Thomas was still there, and building his cattle operation with Edmund Farley, and did not need his sister to do his cooking anymore anyway. Georgia's homestead cabin became a second working structure on what they began to think of as the combined Maddox-Bailey operation, a place for storing hay and feed, and the equipment that Thomas needed for the cattle work. They lived primarily in Lionel's cabin on the ridge for the first summer, because Georgia had wanted to know what it was like to live inside the view from the eastern window, and it was everything she had imagined. She learned the trapline and the trapping methods, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to understand the landscape the way he understood it. And he was an excellent teacher, patient and precise in his explanations, and genuinely pleased when she learned something new. She brought her garden up the mountain, or a portion of it. A cleared patch on the south slope of the cabin's location got enough sun for the vegetables she most valued, and she extended it over the course of the summer with the same systematic attention she gave to everything growing related. He built her a better water channel from the creek above the cabin without being asked, using the flat stone method he had described to her in August of the previous year, and it worked exactly as he had said it would. They came down to the valley frequently. Supper with Thomas, who remained one of her favorite people in the world, and who had become genuinely fond of Lionel in the way that people who are similar in their fundamental honesty tend to find each other trustworthy. Social occasions in Harrow Creek, where Georgia had established herself as a woman whose counsel was worth having, and whose documentation skills had proven useful to the community in ways that went beyond the Voss situation. Church on Sundays when the weather made the trail passable. Lionel was not a man who became comfortable in crowds, but he was a man who understood community as a structure that required maintenance, and he gave what he could to it, which was substantial in practical terms even if it was not social or verbal. He was the person you sent for when something needed to be built correctly or when the situation in the high country required someone who knew the terrain. He came when called. He worked without complaint. He went home afterward. People respected this. It was in the autumn of their first married year that Georgia told him she was expecting their first child. She told him at the eastern window in the morning light, which was where she told him important things, because she had understood very early in their marriage that he received important things best in the places where he was most himself. He was very still for a moment, and then he looked at her with an expression of such unguarded tenderness that she felt it physically. "Is it well with you?" he asked, meaning her health, her feelings, the whole of what she was carrying. "It is more than well," she said. He reached out and took her hand, and they sat together at the eastern window in the morning light, not saying much, just being present in the beginning of the next thing. Their son was born in the spring of 1876. He came into the world at the Ridge Cabin, delivered by the midwife from Clearwater, who made the journey up the mountain with a thoroughness that Georgia admired enormously, on a morning when the snow was still on the high peaks and the lower slopes were green with the urgency of mountain spring. They named him Samuel, after George's father. Lionel held him with a carefulness that was not uncertainty but complete and serious attention, and looked at his son's face with the expression of a man confronting something larger than himself, which was not a position Lionel Bailey encountered often. "He looks like you," Georgia said. "He looks new," Lionel said, which was exactly right. Samuel was a loud, vigorous, curious child who by the time he was old enough to pull himself to standing, was already making purposeful attempts to reach things above his height. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and a personality that combined George's directness with Lionel's observational quietness in a blend that was entirely its own thing. Thomas was an excellent uncle. He came up the mountain for the first time the following August, on a clear day when the trail was excellent, and stood at the eastern window and was rendered temporarily speechless by the view, which Georgia took as appropriate. "You live up here and come down to visit us," he said to Lionel. "Yes," Lionel said. "I have been visiting you," Thomas said, "for a year." "You have," Lionel agreed. Thomas laughed and looked out at the mountains and said, "Fair enough, I suppose," and stayed for the week. The years in Harrow Creek were good years, genuinely and substantively good, in the way that good things are when they have been built rather than simply arrived at. The community grew. The territorial authority extended its reach, which brought both the protections of more consistent law and the complications of more consistent government. And the people of Harrow Creek navigated this the way small communities navigate the encroachment of larger structures, with a combination of adaptation and the specific stubbornness of people who had built something with their hands and were not inclined to be told too much about what to do with it. Georgia became, over the course of the late 1870s, one of the central practical intelligences of the community, not in any official capacity because official capacities for women in the Montana Territory in that era were narrow and mostly nominal, but in the real and functional sense that people brought their problems to her, and she helped them think through solutions. Land disputes, water rights, the occasional crisis of a family in winter difficulty. She was not naive about the injustices of the time, the way women's options were constrained, the way certain families and communities were excluded from protections that others received as a matter of course. She spoke about these things when she had the opportunity, with the clear-eyed, non-performative honesty that was characteristic of her. She helped where she could help, and she named what she could name. There was a Shoshone family, a man named Three Horses and his wife Morning Cloud, who had been displaced from their traditional lands by the same kind of expansionary land pressure that the Voss operation had applied to the settlers, though the injustice in their case was older and deeper, and less likely to be remedied by a lawyer in Clearwater. They had settled in the hills north of Harrow Creek, and the relationship between them and the valley community was complicated and imperfect in the ways that such relationships were, given the history of what had been done, and was still being done to indigenous people across the territory. Georgia made a point of a consistent and respectful relationship with Morning Cloud, which began when she brought supplies during a difficult winter and continued, because Morning Cloud was a woman of extraordinary practical knowledge, and Georgia respected knowledge wherever she found it. Morning Cloud knew the mountain plants in a depth that went far beyond what the white settlers had learned, and she and Georgia developed, over the years, a genuine exchange of knowledge, Georgia's cultivation methods and record-keeping for Morning Cloud's botanical and medicinal knowledge, that was mutually useful And Georgia thought, mutually respectful, though she understood it existed within a context of historical injury that could not be simply wished away by individual kindness. Lionel had his own long-standing relationship with 3 horses, who knew the mountain terrain as well as Lionel did, and who had, in the years before the current political configurations had hardened into their present forms, shared information about the high country with a generosity that Lionel had never forgotten. They were not intimately close, the barriers of language and circumstance being what they were, but they were people who recognized each other's competence and treated each other accordingly, which was more than could be said for many of their contemporaries. Samuel grew up understanding that the world was more complex than the simple stories people sometimes told about it. Georgia and Lionel made sure of this, not through lectures but through the ordinary mechanics of a life that included people of different origins and situations, treated with the same fundamental regard. It was not a perfect education, because no education was, and the world the child grew up in was genuinely unjust in ways that no individual family could correct. But it was the best they could do, and they did it deliberately. The second child, born in the spring of 1879, was a girl. They named her Louise, after no one in particular but the name that suited her, which was a dark-haired, formidably serious infant who developed into a dark-haired, formidably serious small person, with an early and consuming interest in the natural world that suggested she had inherited more of Lionel's mountain sensibility than anyone had quite anticipated. Samuel, who was 3 years old when Louise arrived, took to being a brother with a proprietary enthusiasm that made Georgia laugh and Lionel watch with the careful attention he brought to everything he found valuable. "He is going to be exactly like you," Lionel said one evening, watching Samuel explain something elaborate and mostly fictional to his baby sister, who was looking at him with an attentive skepticism that seemed more than usually sophisticated for a child of 8 months. "He is going to be exactly like himself," Georgia said, "which might include some of you and some of me and things neither of us have figured out yet." "That is a good thing," Lionel said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, watching his children, and then he said with the deliberate simplicity of a man saying the important thing, "I did not know it could be like this." She looked at him. "Like what?" she said. "This much," he said. He was not a man who reached for words when the available ones were not quite right, but she understood him. "I know," she said. She reached over and took his hand the way she had learned to do over their years together, easily and without announcement, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they sat in the evening light of the ridge cabin watching their children, and the mountains were enormous around them, and the valley below was green, and the creek ran along the south boundary of the land that was theirs. And in the growing dark, Georgia thought about all the paths that had brought them both here. The Missouri grief and the Montana arrival, and the blizzard and the bridge boards and the barn raising, and the fence line mornings, and the carving at the creek corner where her name was still visible in the root of the old pine, weathered and grown around but still there, the first place he had ever put her name into the world. She went to the old pine sometimes still. Not often, but sometimes. To look at the letters that were a little more merged with the wood each year, the 2 carvings, his and hers, her full name and his single initial, the first private language they had shared. She thought it was the best record of them, better even than the marriage certificate in the Reverend Alcott's records, because it was what they had been before they had words for it, before they had spoken it aloud, the simple carved truth of what was already real. Harrow Creek became, over the following decade, something that warranted the name of town. A second school was built, a proper one with a teacher who came from the East and who was, to everyone's pleasant surprise, both excellent at his work and comfortable in the territory. A doctor opened a practice. A newspaper appeared, a 2-page affair printed weekly in Clearwater and delivered by a writer who was reliably unreliable about timing but eventually arrived. The post office extension came in 1882, which made correspondence faster and Georgia's relationship with her Missouri relatives more active. The aunt who had written those letters during the first hard winter eventually came out to visit in 1883 and stayed for a month and went back to Missouri with a changed understanding of what her niece had built. Thomas married in 1881, a woman named Helen from Ohio who had come out to stay with the Dobriscu family and whose combination of practicality and warmth immediately struck everyone who met her as excellent. Georgia liked her immediately and without reservation. Thomas, who had waited until he was 27 because he had been careful about it, and because he had been watching his sister's marriage and forming, apparently, a clear idea of what a good one looked like, was genuinely and openly happy, which was the best thing Georgia could have wished for him. Their cattle operation had grown to something substantial by this point. Edmund Farley had proved to be an excellent partner, and Thomas had proved to have a genuine talent for the ranching work, both the animal side and the business side, and the Maddox Farley operation was one of the more stable enterprises in the valley. Georgia had some involvement in the bookkeeping and contracting side of it, which suited her skills, and it gave her a connection to the economic life of the community that she valued. Lionel continued his trapline work and added to it, over the years, a modest but genuine enterprise in guided hunting and mountain expeditions, as more people came to the territory who wanted to experience the high country and had the means to pay someone who actually knew it. He was a good guide, not because he was gregarious, which he was not, but because he was genuinely safe and thoroughly competent, and people who went into the mountains with him came back with all the experience they had been looking for, and none of the injuries they might otherwise have acquired. His reputation spread by word of mouth in the particular way that reputation spread when what is being said is simply true. He built an addition to the Ridge cabin in 1878, 2 additional rooms that made the structure genuinely spacious, and then a covered porch on the south side that looked out over the valley in a way that Georgia loved, where she could sit in the long summer evenings and watch the light change on the mountains and the valley below and feel that the size of her life matched the size of the landscape. Samuel grew up and grew tall and had his mother's green eyes and his father's good hands and a restlessness that took him, at 17, on a long summer journey through the Northern Territory with Lionel, during which he apparently decided that what he wanted was to study medicine, a decision that Georgia received with the specific complex emotion of a mother who is both proud and aware that the world her child wants to enter is far away. He went east for his training at 20, carried well-stocked with his mother's practical organizational skills and his father's careful observation, and came back 6 years later a doctor who set up practice in the growing town of Harrow Creek and was quickly overextended with patients, because the territory always needed more doctors than it had. Louise, who had spent her childhood systematically cataloging every plant and rock and animal she could find in the mountain landscape, became her father's most willing student of the high country, and eventually her mother's co-author of a small practical guide to the garden and medicinal plants of the Bitterroot region, written in the winter of 1889, and distributed to the surrounding communities with the same unceremonious practicality with which Georgia did everything. It was not a famous document, but it was a useful one, and it found its way into enough households to matter. Georgia and Lionel were, in their middle years, what they had always been, 2 people who were genuinely matched in the things that counted, in their honesty and their practicality and their capacity for quiet and their appreciation of the real over the ornamental. They were also, after all the years, still the kind of couple who took each other's hands without announcement and sat together in the evenings and talked about things that mattered and did not feel the need to perform their affection, which was present and warm and daily, and would have been embarrassingly obvious to any observer who had been paying attention. She found him on an evening in their 15th year of marriage carving something at the workbench in the barn. She came up behind him quietly, which she had never quite stopped being able to do, and looked over his shoulder at what he was doing. He was carving a small wooden box. On the lid, in the same neat, careful letters she had first seen in the root of the old pine, he was carving their initials. Not one name. Both of them together. G and L intertwined. She put her arms around him from behind and rested her chin on his shoulder, and he set down the knife and put both hands over hers. "You are still carving," she said. "I expect I always will," he said. "I want to be buried with that box," she said. He laughed, that warm, free laugh she had been collecting since the morning of the mittens. "It is not that kind of box," he said. "It is for your letters from Missouri, the ones you keep in the table drawer." "Even better," she said. He turned his head, and she turned hers, and they looked at each other, close and warm in the dim barn light. And she thought that the thing she had felt when she pressed her fingers into the carved letters at the creek corner, that nameless shifting thing, had grown itself into something that had a name and a weight and a permanence that she trusted entirely. "I love you," she said plainly, because she was Georgia Maddox and she said what she meant when she meant it. "I know," he said, and his voice had everything in it that it had always had, the precision and the warmth and the specific quality of a man who felt things deeply and held them carefully. "I have loved you since before I said your name aloud." "I know," she said. "I found the carving." "You always found everything," he said. "That is what I do," she said. The years continued to be good. Samuel's medical practice expanded, and he married a woman named Elena in 1895. A teacher who had come to Harrow Creek to run the school and who had a wry humor and a warm practicality that Georgia liked immediately. Louise never married, not from absence of opportunity, but from the specific preference of a woman who was fully absorbed in the life she had chosen. Her botanical work and her mountain expeditions and her community contributions and the particular freedom of a person who has decided what they want and arranged for it. Georgia respected this completely. Thomas and Helen had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who were Georgia's niece and nephews, and who grew up regarding the Ridge cabin as a second home, which it functionally was, given how much time they spent there listening to their Uncle Lionel explain the mountains and their Aunt Georgia explain essentially everything else. The old pine at the creek corner was still standing in 1890, when Georgia went to check on it specifically because she had been thinking about it and wanted to see it. The root had grown so much in the 16 years since the carving that the letters were somewhat obscured, the wood having accommodated the marks the way living things accommodate marks, by growing around them rather than erasing them. You could still see them if you knew where to look and knew what you were seeing. She knelt down and looked at it for a long time. The first language between them, the one he had spoken before speaking, the one she had answered before answering, the specific quiet grammar of 2 people finding each other without hurry. She pressed her fingertips into the groove, the way she had the first time, and felt the same thing she had felt then, which was not unchanged but was continuous, the same feeling grown larger and more settled, the way a creek that is the same creek is also always different water. She sat back on her heels and looked at the mountains above the valley, white at the tops in the October cold, and the sky above them, which was the specific blue of high-altitude autumn that she had never stopped finding extraordinary, and the valley below her that was genuinely hers in every way that mattered, the land and the life, and the man on the ridge who had carved her name somewhere private before he ever spoke it aloud, who was up there right now, she knew. Looking out from his eastern window at the same mountains she was looking at, she stood up. She brushed the pine needles from her skirt. She started up the trail toward the ridge. Halfway up, she met him coming down. He had known she would come, or had come looking for her, or had simply started toward the same place at the same time, because after everything they were that kind of people, the kind who moved toward each other without needing to plan it, from the understanding of 2 people who had spent the better part of 2 decades learning what the other one needed and being willing to provide it. He stopped on the trail when he saw her, and she stopped too, and they looked at each other in the October afternoon light, which was golden and specific to this particular mountain slope, and this particular season and this particular life. "I was at the creek corner," she said. "I thought you might be," he said. "You knew. I have known you a long time," he said. She came up the slope to where he was standing, and he put his arm around her and they turned and looked out at the valley together. The Harrow Creek Valley spread below them with its familiar geography, the properties and the roads and the creek running south, the town that had grown from the settlement they had arrived in. Thomas's spread visible in the east section with its expanded cattle operation, the church and the school and the doctor's office where their son worked. "It is a good life," she said. "It is the best life I know," he said. She leaned into him and he held her, and the mountains were around them and the valley was below them and the October light was going gold on everything. And somewhere down at the creek corner, an old pine had their names in it, the beginning of the story grown into the wood and into the landscape and into the years, permanent in the way that things done with care and honesty are permanent. "Come back down with me for supper," she said. "Thomas and Helen are bringing the children." "I will come," he said. They walked down the mountain together in the late afternoon light, his hand in hers, toward the smoke already beginning to rise from the cabin chimney below, toward the family and the supper and the long good evening that was waiting for them. And the mountain stood behind them, enormous and white-topped and full of all the mornings they had watched together. And the creek ran on at the valley's edge, past the old pine with the carved names that no one had to find any more because they were already known. Already spoken, already home.